Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Jeff Hunt. I'm the director of the Centennial Institute, and welcome to our Issue Mondays. This is our monthly lecture series to address the hottest topics of the day. During past Issue Mondays, we've explored doctor-assisted suicide, U.S.-China relations, education reform, immigration reform, the economy, the upcoming election, and much more. The Centennial Institute, our organization, the think tank here, exists to achieve one of Colorado Christian University's strategic objectives. I want you to listen because it's very rare that you have a university that's willing to fight for the things I'm about to list here. The objective that we exist to fulfill is to impact our culture in support of traditional family values, sanctity of life, compassion for the poor, biblical view of human nature, limited government, personal freedom, free markets, natural law, original intent of the Constitution, and Western civilization. Hoorah, right? Good stuff. We have a lot of great events coming up. You probably saw on your chair there, we have a flyer. Al Robertson from Duck Dynasty, he's one of the sons of the Duck Dynasty, will be here with Megan Alexander of Insight Edition this Wednesday afternoon, or this upcoming Wednesday afternoon. To discuss how they've remained committed to their faith while being in the national spotlight. So it's a great lesson for us all to learn. So I invite you all to that. And our next Issue Monday, you're not going to want to miss this, November 14th, will feature a reflection on the outcome of the presidential election, which is going to be important, by our founder, John Andrews. Another hoorah, huh? We're going to have John back, and he's going to be giving us a reflection on the outcome of the election and his friendship with Bill Armstrong over the last 40 years. So it'll be great. I want to highlight a few of our special guests here today. We have in the audience CU Regent John Carson right here. Stand up, Mr. Carson. Great. We have Don Hood with Worldview, Calling and Culture. Don, stand on up. You probably saw him at the Western Conservative Summit. He was great. My wife, Nicole Hunt, one of the most important special guests. Stand up. We have 4 young children, 7 and under. She's doing the real hard work of raising the next generation of conservatives. We also have here former Senator Hank Brown. Mr. Brown, Senator Brown, please stand up. Thank you for coming. Great to have you here with us. Thank you, sir. And of course, I'm very excited to introduce our brand new president at Colorado Christian University, President Don Sweeting, right here. Before we get started, please join me, if you can, in standing in a prayer in our pledge. We're going to have President Sweeting lead us in prayer now, and then Carrie Bram, our operations manager of the Centennial Institute, will lead us in the pledge. President Sweeting?
Thank you. It's great. This is my first Issue Monday, so what a delight to be here and to be at Colorado Christian University. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for those things that never change. We thank you that your kingdom is, as the scripture says, an eternal kingdom, that your dominion endures from generation to generation, that you are one who is enthroned from of old, and that you don't change. We thank you, Lord, for our nation and for self-evident truths and for ordered liberty. We thank you for what is true, honest, just, right, pure, and lovely. We thank you for CCU, for raising it up for a time such as this, and for the good work of the Centennial Institute. Pray your blessing on our time tonight. Help us to think clearly and to love you with our minds as well as our hearts. We ask all this in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Right behind me.
Please join me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Great. You may have a seat. All right. As you know, the election is 22 days away, 3 weeks from tomorrow. The final debate is this Wednesday. In fact, Hillary Clinton is running a contest right now. Did you hear about this? The winner of the contest gets to sit next to Bill Clinton and watch the debate live, which begs the question, what does the loser get? Won't go there. Won't go there. No, in all seriousness, did you see Al Gore campaigned with Hillary Clinton in Florida this week? which, you wonder, really, out of all the states, you're going to take Al Gore to Florida? But, it worked out. It worked out. They had 1,600 attendees. After a recount, they found out they had 1,300 attendees. But, there's some hanging chads around, that type of thing. Final joke. Did you see in the WikiLeaks emails that Hillary Clinton met with rappers? She met with rappers a few times to explore how she could do better with her youth outreach. And they came up with a few rapper names for Hillary Clinton. The first one was called Runs DNC. Didn't work out all that well. The Bernie Sanders people weren't that happy about Runs DNC. So the second one worked out a lot better. So if you see Hillary Clinton, you can call her, Secretary Clinton, or you can call her by her new rap name, Email Delita. So, no, in all seriousness, we'll get started tonight. To introduce our speaker, please join me in welcoming our Vice President of Development, the great Paul Eldridge.
Great to see you. Thanks. Well, thank you, Jeff. The great. That's great. Thank you very much. Well, listen, we're in for a great evening tonight with Dr. Beckwith. He holds 5 earned degrees, including the MA and PhD in philosophy from Fordham University and the Master of Juridical Studies in Law from the Washington University School of Law in St. Louis. He's authored over a dozen books, including Taking Rites Seriously, Law, Politics, and the Reasonableness of Faith, and Defending Life, a Moral and Legal Case Against Abortion Choice, both published by Cambridge University Press. He has published over 100 academic articles, book chapters, critical reviews, and reference work entries in a variety of publications across a diversity of disciplines. Dr. Beckwith has held visiting faculty appointments at Princeton University, where he served as the 2002-2003 Madison Research Fellow in the Department of Politics in the University of Notre Dame, where he was the 2008-2009 Mary Ann Remick Senior Visiting Fellow in the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture. Dr. Beckwith is currently the visiting scholar in conservative thought and policy at the University of Colorado for the 2016-17 academic year. I have a distant but fond personal memory related to Dr. Beckwith. I had the good fortune of being a student of his in the summer of 1997 at Trinity Graduate School in Orange County, California. The course was Advanced Christian Ethics, and Dr. Beckwith was one of my very favorite professors during those graduate and law school years. So it gives me great pleasure then, almost 20 years later, to have the opportunity to introduce him to you this evening. While his subject tonight is the future of conservatism, he does speak and write brilliantly on many other topics. Would you please help me welcome Dr. Francis Beckwith?
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Paul, for that warm and kind introduction. The topic, the future of conservatism. When Jeff asked me to do that, I thought to myself, that's a lot. It's tough enough to talk about the past. So my thoughts this evening, I'm going to be focusing on just certain topics concerning the conservative movement, ones that particularly interest me, and I'm sure there are going to be many people here that are going to disagree with what I say, and this is really the first time where I've actually expressed these thoughts in public. So I'm very much interested in hearing your feedback, because many of us come to these discussions, especially when it comes to political movements or ideas about what we think is good for the country and so forth. We come to those issues from our own particular perspective. I'm a philosopher who went to law school. I'm an academic. So I'm sure there are going to be people that have a different understanding. So let me begin then with a trigger warning. I'm going to say some things this evening that are not going to be easy to hear, especially for those of us who think of ourselves as political and social conservatives. But they have to be said if we have any hope of trying to properly grapple with the topic of this lecture, the future of conservatism. Having said that, I'm going to say some things that are not going to be pleasing to liberals and progressives. Much of that discussion will focus on how liberalism, the liberalism of FDR, Harry Truman, and JFK,
that helped defeat communism and Nazism has been betrayed by those who now claim to be the heirs of that political philosophy. In fact, I'm going to argue that this older liberalism, which I call rock-ribbed liberalism, if recovered and given a pride of place in American political discourse, is essential to conservatism's survival and flourishing. So don't say you have not been warned. When Jeff first contacted me in February and invited me to give this lecture at Colorado Christian University, and we discussed the title, The Future of Conservatism, I thought to myself, it's going to be a short talk. Conservatism, at least as it is thought of in the popular imagination, does not seem to have much of a future. A once great political philosophy that gave us Russell Kirk, William F. Buckley, Frederick Hayek, Ronald Reagan, with all their gifts of insight, wit, and statesmanship, is now led by Donald Trump. After losing the last two presidential elections to an intelligent and attractive, though deeply flawed progressive Democrat, America's Conservative Party nominated for the top of its ticket what appears to many as a walking, talking stereotype of what conservatism's adversaries want you to believe it really stands for. The vibrant movement that ushered Reagan into the White House in 1980, followed by a 49-state landslide in 1984, could not, in 2016, summon the wisdom or the will to address the legitimate concerns of many of our fellow citizens who are in fact drawn to the Trump candidacy. Instead, their concerns were dismissed and ridiculed. Think about it. When these citizens sincerely raise serious questions about illegal immigration, they are called xenophobes and racists. When they pursue religious liberty legislation to ensure they and their neighbors are not coerced to participate in liturgical events prohibited by their moral theology, they are labeled bigots trying to weaponize religious liberty. When they try to form nonprofit corporate entities to advance their own civic beliefs in the public square, they are targeted by the Internal Revenue Service for special evaluation. When they appeal to principles of justice, once widely thought to be an antidote to racial and gender and ethnic discrimination and prejudice, in their opposition to policies that require that race, gender, and ethnicity be taken into consideration in hiring and school admissions, they are accused of advancing a culture of discrimination and prejudice. When they want to protect and nurture their own institutions, their colleges, charitable organizations, civic groups, in ways that can resist cultural trends that they believe are deleterious to the integrity of those entities, they are not only sneered at, but become the subject of calls to remove their tax-exempt status. They are confused by a political leadership that praises the virtues of diversity, but at the same time seems to want to use cultural and governmental power to make sure that everyone thinks alike and every institution looks the same, and encourages the view that dissenters are to be marginalized and denied social respect. They can no longer trust an educated political elite that rejects the transparent rules of governance outlined in the Constitution while outsourcing unaccountable administrative agencies to do their legislative and executive dirty work. The IRS, the EPA, the HHS, the DOA, the DOJ, etc. Like Bill Foster, Michael Douglas's character in Falling Down, you remember that movie? These voters are asking, I'm the bad guy, how did that happen? So desperate to be heard and taken seriously by a condescending and unsympathetic elite, these citizens chose as their standard bearer a thrice-married, strip-joint-owning casino mogul who flouts property rights, casually brags of his sexual conquests in the language of assault, and is probably not a conservative. And yet, he has tapped into an anger that is real in America. It arises from a frustration that our elected officials have largely abandoned the working class for the adulation of corporate America and elite culture. My point in making this observation is not to imply any recommendation on how one ought not to vote in November. Rather, my point is to put in as stark terms as possible the degree to which conservatism has drifted from its moorings and how its leadership's failure to address the concerns of the Trump voter created the vacuum that was filled by someone whose narrow appeal will allow the Conservative Party to once again at the presidential level snatch defeat out of the jaws of victory and perhaps lose both houses of Congress as well. However, it should go without saying that I am not offering a brief for the other major party's candidate in this presidential race. As is well known, she has committed her own share of ethical and legal indiscretions and has put the security of this nation at risk by prioritizing her own ambitions for the White House over the good of the nation. The nominees of both parties are such unpopular figures that, according to a report published in May on the website 538, quote, Clinton and Trump are both more strongly disliked than any nominee at this point in the past 10 presidential cycles, unquote. It's almost as if It's a Wonderful Life's Mr. Potter were running against Cruella de Vil of 101 Dalmatians. So given all that, what is the future of conservatism? Here I defer to the authority of my favorite philosopher, Yogi Berra. It's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. So this evening, what I do not want to do is try to predict the future, but rather to suggest ways to think about conservatism and what its presence in American politics ought to look like given current social and cultural realities. But in order to do that, we first have to define what conservatism is and assess the different versions of it that have arisen over the past half century or so. So we're going to do that. What is conservatism? Conservatism, or at least American conservatism, is very difficult to define, since its differing manifestations arise historically as reactions against specific cultural and political events, trends, and movements. For this reason, under the umbrella of conservatism, one can find a diversity of sometimes contrary points of view and policy prescriptions. In some ways, American conservatism is like a church consisting of parishioners who share a creed about which they are conspicuously unaware until they discover a heretic within their midst. It is then and only then that they begin offering reasons and constructing arguments for what they had believed was just common sense until the heretic arrived. This is why many writers often refer to conservatism as a kind of pre-analytic. By the way, when a philosopher says pre-analytic, what he or she means is simply, it just strikes people as right before they think about it, which is what, and most of the time people are right. So for many writers, they often refer to conservatism as a kind of pre-analytic respect for the givenness of the proper ends of human nature that is expressed in an enduring moral order sustained and inculcated by custom and convention in continuity with the generations that preceded us and that represent a reservoir of inherited wisdom that no one age could have itself created. As Russell Kirk puts it, in essence, the conservative person is simply one who finds the permanent things more pleasing than chaos and old night. A people's historic continuity of experience, says the conservative, offers a guide to policy far better than the abstract designs of coffeehouse philosophers, unquote. Or, I might add, TED Talk social scientists or evolutionary biologists. Consequently, in order to understand conservatism and to properly explore the topic of this evening, we have to ask ourselves how well this devotion to both permanent things and our inherited traditions has been expressed in our politics over the past 5 decades in 4 different areas of concern. Pardon me? I still have to get used to your dryness. It's better, though, than Central Texas. My wife texted me and said it's 92 degrees and about, 60% humidity. So let me just say that again. We have to ask ourselves how well this devotion to both permanent things and our inherited traditions has been expressed in our politics over the past 5 decades in 4 different areas of common concern to which conservatives have typically gravitated. And these are the areas: constitutional law, economics, national security, and public morality. In each area, conservatives have made their presence known with differing degrees of success and failure. So first, judicial conservatism. Judicial conservatism, sometimes called originalism, is a reaction against a way of reading statutes and constitutions that seems to bypass the ordinary avenues of representative government. Virtually unknown as an identifiable judicial philosophy just 50 years ago, it has become such an important concept that whenever a president, whether a Democrat or a Republican, makes an appointment to the federal bench, the prospective judge or justice will claim that if placed on the court, he or she will interpret the legal text as originally understood. They all say that. This is why when Harvard Law School Dean Elena Kagan was nominated in 2009 by President Obama to our nation's highest court, she said in response to a question in a form given to her by the Senate Judiciary Committee, quote, "There is no federal constitutional right to same-sex marriage," unquote. However, in 2015, Justice Kagan found such a right. Even Justice Stephen Breyer, who does not identify as an originalist, nevertheless argues that the Constitution does not require originalism, which means that he appeals to the document's original meaning and thinks that the founders understood it in a certain way in order to reject originalism. So there's a sense in which originalism has kind of won the day. That is, it's the default position that everyone has to genuflect to. I'm Catholic, I can use the word genuflect for those who... When Justice Kennedy issued his opinion in Obergefell v. Hodges, the Supreme Court case that found a constitutional right to same-sex marriage, he made a kind of originalist argument. He writes that, quote, "From their beginning to their most recent page, the annals of human history reveal the transcendent importance of marriage." By the way, whenever Kennedy uses adjectives like that, be very nervous. They usually are, they make up for the reasoning that should have been there. After citing Confucius and Cicero, and acknowledging how untold references to the beauty and grandeur of marriage have been expressed through the ages in a variety of forms and across different cultures, he concedes that it is fair and necessary to say that these references were based on the understanding that marriage is a union between two persons of the opposite sex. Unquote. He goes on to affirm that the centrality of marriage to the human condition makes it unsurprising that the institution has existed for millennia and across civilizations. Since the dawn of history, marriage has transformed strangers into relatives, binding families and societies together, unquote. It kind of reminds me of that quote from Roe v. Wade where Justice Blackmun said, "If man is to survive, pregnancy will always be with us." He literally said that. You know immediately that you're in the presence of no small intellect. Now, even though originalism is in a much better place in the popular culture and the law schools than it was 50 years ago, and even though the presence of conservative judges and justices spread throughout the federal judiciary has forced non-originalists to wrestle with their arguments and to craft opinions that sound originalist, the politicizing of the courts has been ratcheted up significantly. A prospective jurist's judicial philosophy and its implication for a specific set of issues dealing with abortion, marriage, religion, race relations, and political speech is now the exclusive focus of presidential appointments to the federal bench. The irony of originalism's success is that it has allowed non-originalist political figures to imply, on the one hand, that some form of originalism is essential to a properly functioning judiciary, while on the other hand, explicitly promising their supporters that they will only appoint judges and justices that will follow specific left-of-center policy prescriptions that at one time in our nation's history had been decided by the states and/or our federal government's political branches. Now on to economic conservatism. Economic conservatism is a response to the rise of the welfare state and the incremental increasing of taxation, which, as many have argued, results in diminished economic growth and a mounting permanent underclass in American society. It has been well documented, for example, that the U.S. government's now defunct aid to families with dependent children, though intended to financially help single mothers below the poverty line, actually resulted in a dramatic increase in out-of-wedlock births. Because the government, according to ADFC critics, was literally paying women for having children out of wedlock, it got what it paid for. but it got more social pathologies and thus more poverty as well. In 1996, however, President Clinton, a Democrat, in cooperation with the Republican Congress, signed legislation that ended ADFC and replaced it with a program called Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. Although many critics of President Clinton's welfare reform in 1996 predicted dire consequences for the poor, in 2006, the liberal magazine, The New Republic, pointed out that, quote, a broad consensus now holds that welfare reform was certainly not a disaster, and it may, in fact, have worked much as its designers had hoped for, unquote. Given the power of free markets to create wealth, lift people out of poverty, and produce more essential commodities than any other system in the history of the world, economic conservatives are right in touting their views as empirically demonstrable. Yet, as some communitarians and social conservatives have pointed out, the logic of the market, without the moral infrastructure and limits of a stable civil society, has a tendency to colonize institutions and practices that sustain goods that by their very nature cannot be items of consumption. Consider these examples. Should we extend the market's understanding of goods, quote unquote, to account for the good of family life? If parents begin to think of their children as commodities whose value is determined by the free market, is that more rational than our immediate belief that our offspring, by virtue of being human persons, are intrinsically valuable beings of immeasurable worth? Suppose I begin thinking of my bodily organs as property, rather than as real parts of my embodied self that were bestowed on me as gifts by God or nature for which I'm specially responsible. Or what happens when I start to believe that my marriage is merely a legal recognition of a contractually discharged living arrangement rather than a permanent exclusive bond sealed by a promise made to my wife and before God that I am bound by the natural and divine law not to break? Or suppose I begin thinking of my religious faith not as a duty imposed on me by an eternal sovereign that I am obligated by conscience to obey, but rather as a set of beliefs I have freely chosen in order to meet what I believe are my most important needs and desires. In each of these cases, applying the logic of the market has a deflationary effect on the goods in question. They cease to be thought of as intrinsic goods that are worth pursuing or having for their own sake, but rather as instrumental commodities that are good only insofar as the desiring self may want them. They become raw materials over which the self may exercise its power to do with them as it pleases. This is precisely where a rift has developed within conservatism, between what I call market conservatives and traditional moralists. Market conservatives typically argue that because free markets have been so efficient and successful in producing wealth and prosperity, and thus allowing us to enjoy many other goods, the reasoning of the market should be applied to all aspects of life. Because the values of commodities is discovered by calculating the price for which people are willing to pay for them, the value of all apparent goods, including those givens of human nature that traditional moralists believes are objective intrinsic goods and not the product of the human will, carry no more normative weight whatsoever for the market conservative. As he sees it, these givens, far from being truths of human nature on which the common good depends, are constraints on the liberty of each individual to pursue his own subjective vision of the good life. For this reason, for the market conservative, the almost exclusive goal of politics is limited government, by which he means not only a free market economy, but also the elimination of laws or customs that interfere with the pursuit of the desiring self. Thus, on this account, the common good, if you can even call it that, is measured by how unencumbered the individual is from tradition, nature, family ties, religion, etc., to acquire what he wants and when he wants it. And yet, in practical politics, market conservatives and traditional moralists have often found themselves employing similar vocabulary and arriving at similar conclusions on matters of policy, though their underlying rationales are remarkably different. Like the market conservative, the traditional moralist often advances the cause of limited government. So, for example, both will support free markets for such an economic system as, I've already noted, has the best track record of raising standards of living. But what's the point of raising standards of living? For the market conservative, the great end, as C.S. Lewis put it in The Abolition of Man, is to get people fed and clothed. Lewis himself, by the way, was no market conservative. The question of how these citizens conduct their lives, whether they follow the precepts of natural justice, is outside the law's jurisdiction, as long as their conduct does not interfere with the private choices of their fellow citizens to pursue their own visions of the good life. Although the traditional moralist agrees with the market conservative that the acquisition of wealth and being fed and clothed are good things, he views them as worthy of pursuit only because they assist him in advancing his natural duties to spouse, progeny, neighbor, nation, and God. For the traditional moralist, liberty is the freedom to pursue the unchosen goods of natural justice unencumbered by certain external agents, such as criminals or unjust governments. For the market conservative, liberty is freedom to pursue whatever one desires, unencumbered by any non-chosen obligations to spouse, progeny, neighbor, nation, or God. For the traditional moralist, the good is what is desirable in itself, while for the market conservative, desiring something is what makes that something good. As long as free markets and their moral limits were contextualized within a cultural infrastructure that was not consciously inimical to the goals of the traditional moralist, an alliance between market and moral conservatism made a lot of sense. The traditional moralist had good instrumental reasons to support free markets, while the market conservative had good pragmatic reasons to accept the givens of the wider culture, whose mandarins did not have as their primary mission to crush traditional institutions and ways of life and any public dissent that may flow from them. But that's not the world we live in anymore. We reside in a world in which major corporations have created a cultural cartel, a moral monopoly, by which they hope to make the price of acquiescence so cheap and resistance so expensive that their ideological competition will either undergo a hostile takeover or declare civilizational bankruptcy. Perhaps, as some have noted, the market conservative, some people have argued, was never a true friend of the moral conservative. I think that's simplistic and not the case. But we can't ignore the place and time at which we find ourselves. In fact, in my own sort of pilgrimage to conservatism as a young man, some of the authors that influenced me deeply were Michael Novak and George Gilder, and a young congressman from Georgia named Newt Gingrich, who authored a book called Window of Opportunity, all of which really appealed to the fact that free markets within the context of a moral order actually led to not only human flourishing economically, but also in terms of civil society. As somebody that was a young liberal at the time, that was the kind of argument that drew me to conservatism. It was one that suggested that markets, far from being hostile to the poor, actually elevated them. But it was always within the context of a moral order. Let's move on to foreign policy conservatism. Foreign policy conservatism arises out of the Cold War. Seeing communism as intrinsically antithetical to the ideals of American constitutionalism, as well as a threat to world peace, foreign policy conservatives maintain that the only way to prevent the spread of communism was by having a dominant military with overwhelming defense capabilities. Given the stagnant nature of communist economies in the decades following the Cold War, the Second World War, foreign policy conservatives relied on the West's economic growth and prosperity to not only spend the Soviet Union and its allies into oblivion, but to offer an attractive alternative to the subjugated masses trapped behind the Iron Curtain. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, it was not Mr. Gorbachev that tore it down, as President Reagan had suggested just 18 months earlier at that Brandenburg Gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. I had to find some way to do that. Yeah, it was his vice president. All right. But I beat you. Okay, that's my dueling presidents. So when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, it was not Mr. Gorbachev that tore it down, as President Reagan had suggested just 18 months earlier at the Brandenburg Gate. Rather, it was the peoples of East and West Berlin. The day before this happened, our own intelligence agencies had no idea of the cataclysm that awaited the dictators of the people's republics of what was then called the Second World. What followed for the next decade or so was a vacation from history. which ended on September 11, 2001, with the terrorist attacks in New York City and Washington, D.C. As the world's only superpower, possessing the greatest military in the history of the world, we confidently invaded Afghanistan and then Iraq. With our superior might and technological sophistication, we were promised that victory would be swift, the terrorists would quickly share the same fate as Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, and that the draw of Western culture and its freedoms would, like it did in the waning days of the Cold War, result in millions of oppressed peoples resisting their leaders and embracing the principles of liberal democracy and American constitutionalism. Those military adventures, however well-meaning, have not quite turned out that way. Our experiences in the Second World War and the Cold War, as well as our beliefs about religion and its place in the polity, were so formative in the way in which we looked at the world, including the Islamic world, that we just couldn't imagine why our way of life did not appeal to every reasonable person on earth. Because the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were initiated by a conservative president, and a very good man, I might add, conservatism, rightly or wrongly, has been saddled with the consequences. For this reason, conservatism finds itself today divided over the role of what role the United States should play in the world. But the fact is that given America's economic and military might, a United States that withdraws too much from world affairs sends the message to bad actors that there will be no consequences for their mischief. As we have seen over the past 8 years, a purely rhetorical presidency, one that speechifies loudly and carries a little stick, only emboldens Moscow, Tehran, and Damascus. Social conservatism. Social conservatism is a response to changing cultural mores that eventually find their way into law. The pro-life movement, for example, gained steam after the U.S. Supreme Court hands down Roe v. Wade. Ironically, since that court decision, the pro-life movement has had remarkable success in changing many minds on the issue of abortion, even though the courts have upheld very few restrictions on the practice. However, as many libertine beliefs about human sexuality, marriage, entertainment, gambling, pornography, etc., have gained mainstream currency in American culture, social conservatives have not only changed few minds, they have slowly over time appropriated these new mores into their own private lives and institutions. Although social conservatism arises as a counter to the sexual revolution, the advocates of which had argued that they simply wanted to be left alone, social conservatives now find themselves fighting for the preservation and integrity of their own institutions and religious conscience because their political adversaries will not leave them alone. The great irony here is that the once impressive liberal defenders of the freedoms of speech, religion, and association have transformed themselves into the prudish, reactionary busybodies that had been the object of their own ridicule and derision in the 1960s through the 1980s. For example, during oral arguments in Obergefell v. Hodges, Justice Samuel Alito, relying on the reasoning of the 1983 case, Bob Jones v. the United States, asked U.S. Solicitor General Donald Verrilli if private religious colleges would be subject to loss of tax-exempt status if same-sex marriage were to be legally recognized as a constitutional right. General Verrilli answered, quote, I don't think I can answer that question without knowing more specifics. But it's certainly going to be an issue. I don't deny that. Justice Alito. It is going to be an issue, unquote. This, by the way, is the dominant view among elites. For instance, University of Chicago philosopher and legal scholar Martha Nussbaum has suggested that the reasoning of the Bob Jones case should apply to Catholic universities that require their presidents to be priests. Why? She believes that because this requirement means that only men can hold these presidencies, because only men can become Catholic priests, it stands to reason this policy is discriminatory and the schools should lose their tax-exempt status. This movement toward the ideological colonization of religious conscience, as both Pope Francis and Cardinal Robert Sarah have labeled it, was put on full display this past week when WikiLeaks released private email exchanges between Jennifer Palmeri of the Clinton campaign, John Halpin, Sandy Newman, and John Podesta of the Center for American Progress. Commenting on the fact that Rupert Murdoch, who owns the Wall Street Journal, and Robert Thompson, its managing editor, were raising their children Catholic, Halpin writes, quote, friggin', he actually put friggin', so he watched himself. Friggin' Murdoch baptized his kids in the Jordan where John the Baptist baptized Jesus. Many of the most powerful elements of the conservative movement are all Catholic, many converts, from the Supreme Court and think tanks to the media and social groups. It's an amazing bastardization of their faith. They must be attracted to the systematic thought and severely backwards gender relations and must be totally unaware of Christian democracy, unquote. Palmari replied, quote, I imagine they think it is the most socially acceptable, politically conservative religion. Their rich friends wouldn't understand if they became evangelicals, unquote. Halpin responded, excellent point. They can throw around Thomistic thought and subsidiarity and sound sophisticated because no one knows what the hell they're talking about, unquote. 10 months later, Newman expressed frustration with the fact that many Catholics do not agree with their church on social issues. This is what he writes. There needs to be a Catholic spring in which Catholics themselves demand the end of a Middle Ages dictatorship and the beginning of a little democracy and respect for gender equality in the Catholic Church. Podesta replied, quote, we created Catholics in Alliance for the Common Good to organize for a moment like this, but I think it lacks the leadership to do so now. Likewise, Catholics United. Like most spring movements, I think this one will have to be bottom up, unquote. Both those organizations, by the way, have been around for quite some time, and it's come out through WikiLeaks that they've been funded by George Soros. As a practical matter, this crusade for liberal hegemony has been most successfully prosecuted in several cases involving proprietors who have run afoul of certain anti-discrimination laws. The most well-known cases have concerned a baker in Colorado, a photographer in New Mexico, and a florist in Washington State. In each case, the proprietor declined to do business with a gay or lesbian couple who tried to procure their services for a ceremony or event that celebrated the couple's wedding. Each of the parties offered different legal accounts. It depended on the nature of the law in the particular state. So some states had state versions of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Others had just a provision in the Constitution that was similar, if not identical, to our First Amendment. So each party argued differently for why they should receive an exemption under the state's law or under the anti-discrimination law. Nevertheless, in every case, the courts ruled in favor of the complainant couple, maintaining the proprietor, by declining service, discriminated against the customer based on his or her sexual orientation in violation of the jurisdiction's anti-discrimination law. It was interesting, the lawyers for the defendants in these cases all made an argument that I thought was a very plausible argument, but none of them were accepted by the courts, and that it wasn't the sexual orientation of the customer, but the nature of the ceremony. And that seemed to make sense. In a recent article I published in an online journal published by Liberty Fund called Law and Liberty, I use an illustration to kind of explain this. Imagine you know of somebody, we'll call him Russell. I pick Russell because Russell Moore is a friend of mine and he's a Baptist, and this involves a Baptist. So supposing Russell Moore is a photographer, and he's a very devout Baptist, and his friend Aristotle Jones, comes to see him, and he says, and Aristotle happens to be Greek Orthodox. And Aristotle says, Russell, I'd like to hire you to take photographs at the baptism of my son Socrates. And so Russell says, you know, Aristotle, you're a friend, but I don't believe that event that you're actually taking Socrates to is really a baptism. I believe in believer's baptism. That's what I believe as a Baptist. And so I really feel it's uncomfortable and awkward for me to cooperate with that. In fact, I'll take a picture of you and Socrates by any body of water you want. In a bathtub, in the ocean, by a hose, etc. But at the end of the day, what I will not do is participate in a liturgical event that I don't think is real. Okay? And so what does Aristotle do? He says, I'm sorry, my friend, but that's okay. We'll still remain friends, and I'll hire the Catholic photographer down the street. He has no problem with infant baptism. That, to me, sounds like a really persuasive argument. For some reason, the courts rejected that. Now, in a concurring opinion in the New Mexico case, Justice Richard Bossum suggests that religious liberty must sit in the back of the secular bus once those who choose to exercise it enter the marketplace. And this is a quote from the concurring opinion. The defendants are free to think, to say, to believe, as they wish. They may pray to the God of their choice and follow those commandments in their personal lives wherever they lead, unquote. Notice the language of the market, the God of their choice, as if our beliefs are simply those things that we arrive at, like when we arrive at a supermarket, right? Honey, I'm going to Trader Joe's. Can I pick up something? Yeah, why don't you pick up some Buddhism while you're there, right? That's not the way people think about their religious beliefs. In fact, if you think about it, most of the beliefs you hold, you don't consciously choose them. Try unbelieving that you're here, right? And most of our theological beliefs are like that. It's not a matter of will. We oftentimes come to our beliefs in indirect ways. Sometimes we just find ourselves believing those things. But to treat religion as if it were just a commodity is itself, I think, just one of the most offensive things that I can possibly imagine. But for somebody that has been tutored in their entire adult life in that way of thinking, it does seem to make sense. So let me continue here in the justice's opinion. The Constitution protects the defendants in that respect and much more, but there is a price, one that we will all have to pay somewhere in our civic life. In the smaller, more focused world of the marketplace, of commerce, of public accommodation, the defendants have to channel their conduct, not their beliefs, so as to leave space for other Americans who believe something different. In short, I would say to the defendants with the utmost respect, it is the price of citizenship, unquote. So here one finds the logic of the market, the idea of man as merely homo economicus, his citizenship reducible to the roles of buyer and seller, being employed as a means by which to eliminate from our view what many of us believe is more fundamental to our natures as human beings, our beliefs about those ultimate and permanent things by which our conscience is guided. The lesson for those of us who consider ourselves religious and social conservatives is clear. We need to care about politics because politics, whether we like it or not, cares or will care about us. The idea that the government will, quote unquote, leave the church alone as long as it minds its own business has been rarely borne out in practice historically. To be sure, the American experiment, until relatively recently, is the exception and not the norm in human history. But there's no assurance that it will not eventually appropriate the growing hostility to religious free exercise found among elites in education, law, and media. For this reason, social and religious conservatives have to be especially diligent in protecting the integrity of the message and mission of their own institutions, including churches, schools, and charitable organizations, even if it means boldly challenging the conventional wisdom of the dominant culture. So I'm going to conclude now with, what about the future of conservatism? We've gone over constitutional, economic conservatism, social conservatism, and foreign policy conservatism. They've met with differing degrees of success in American politics. I believe, however, that the future of conservatism hinges on growing and sustaining those subsidiary institutions. You know, that word that was mentioned by Palmari of the Clinton campaign, those institutions from which conservative thought most naturally arises. So let me just say that again. I cut myself off. I believe that the future of conservatism hinges on growing and sustaining those subsidiary institutions from which conservative thought most naturally arises. That is to say, those institutions those entities that neither refer to the individual nor the state. Those institutions such as churches, families, civic organizations, private schools, and so forth. But in order to do that, conservatives have to make it their project to do two things. One, limit the size of the administrative state, and two, offer a principled defense of traditional liberal ideas of freedom of speech and association. As we've seen over the past decade or so, the most egregious violations of individual liberty do not come from specific pieces of legislation offered by Congress or states or municipalities, but rather from regulations issued by unelected administrative agencies. Consider the following examples. The problems with the HHS mandate for closely held businesses and religious organizations like the Sisters of the Poor, Hobby Lobby, and so forth, did not arise from anything in the text of the Affordable Care Act. In fact, when I teach religion and the law, which actually I will be teaching this spring at the University of Colorado in the political science department. I teach it at Baylor, which is my permanent appointment every other year. Recently, when I taught it last time, I asked my students to find in the Affordable Care Act where the mandate is, the contraceptive mandate. They couldn't find it because it's not there. Why did it become such an issue? Rather, it arose from a letter issued by the HHS secretary as a consequence of powers given to her by the ACA. Essentially, Congress gave her the power to make laws, enforce them, and fine those who violated them. This is something that's been going on for quite some time. It's just not unique to this particular issue, but it is unique in the sense that you've never seen anything quite like it when it comes to religious liberty. It's an example I use I have a new book that just came out called Taking Rites Seriously. I have a whole chapter on the HHS mandate. By the way, it's rights, it's R-I-T-E-S, the title of the book, Taking Rites Seriously. It's a play on the word R-I-G-H-T-S. I use this illustration. Imagine we had a conservative administration and had a conservative Secretary of Health and Human Services who, reading literature, not by Planned Parenthood, but by the National Rifle Association, came to the conclusion that gun ownership actually decreases crime, and decreased crime helps health. So she then issues a regulation saying that every business must supply their employees with a weapon and ammunition. Now imagine then a Quaker business, a business owned by Quakers, says, we can't pay for this directly. These are instruments of violence. We're pacifists. Now, whenever I've used that illustration, everyone goes, yeah, of course that's wrong, right? Even if, let's say, the statistics, in fact, do prove that. It's irrelevant. A person's individual liberty shouldn't be dependent on whether they should be forced to assist others, right? But in any event, this is what happened. We had the HHS secretary issuing this with the power to not only issue the law, but enforce it and fine those who violate it. The Departments of Justice and Education can, without the direct approval of America's law-making body, Congress, interpret Title IX so that private institutions receiving any level of federal funding must conform to a particular set of beliefs and practices, even if in violation of the institution's long-held mission. The IRS has the power to assess whether a nonprofit organization, such as a school or a church, has violated public policy, and thus should have its nonprofit status revoked. It's easy to imagine a future Department of Education in collusion with the IRS deciding, for example, that Colorado Christian University's requirement that students and faculty practice Christian morality in their private and public lives violates not only Title IX, but also the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. We can, of course, cite other examples from any number of the alphabet agencies that dominate our federal system. But the point is this: conservatives ignore at their own peril the growing administrative state and its power to limit and eliminate the institutions by which conservatives have traditionally communicated their ideas to the wider public. As we have seen over the past decade or so, traditional liberal understandings of freedom of speech and association have fallen on hard times. With the prevalence and pervasiveness, that's a tough one, pervasiveness of speech codes on public university campuses and the use of private corporations and social media to silence dissent against those who have the temerity to challenge progressive ideas, conservatives should be in the forefront of defending what I like to call rock-ribbed liberalism. It was your daddy's liberalism, the sort whose champions would say something like this. I'm going to quote from three people, and I'll tell you who they are after I quote each one. Quote, "If all mankind minus one were of one opinion and only one person were of the contrary opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power to be justified in silencing mankind." Unquote. That's John Stuart Mill, the great 19th century liberal philosopher who served in Parliament. Or this: if there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein. If there are any circumstances which permit an exception, they do not now occur to us. It's Justice Robert Jackson, 1943. Justice Jackson, some of you know, was the lead attorney for the Allied powers at the Nuremberg trial, where he offered an eloquent defense of why, or an eloquent case of why it was appropriate for the victors in that war to prosecute the Nazis. Or even this: but what I am suggesting is this. Let me begin, quote, but what I am suggesting is this: secularists are wrong when they ask believers to leave their religion at the door before entering into the public square. Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, William Jennings Bryan, Dorothy Day, Martin Luther King Jr. Indeed, the majority of great reformers in American history were not only motivated by faith, but repeatedly used religious language to argue for their cause. So to say that men and women should not inject their personal morality into public policy debates is a practical absurdity. Our law is by definition a codification of morality, much of it grounded in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Senator Barack Obama, 2006. Driving this liberalism was true tolerance, not the faux tolerance that is really just the old moralistic intolerance with a better marketing team, anti-religious inclinations, and far more political and bureaucratic power. In the old days, before social media's instrumentalizing and tacit approval of the once rightly condemned peer pressure, remember that? Don't fall to peer pressure. Now it's like, how many likes do I have? You know, it's like peer pressure now has become good. When did that happen? Your parents or your teachers or both would give you some pointers on how to manage your reflexes and navigate your thoughts in a free and open society. I know that not everyone's parents were rock liberals like mine, but I can't help you with that. This would usually happen after you complained or whined about hearing, seeing, or reading something that challenged your deeply held beliefs or forced you to think in ways that were uncomfortable and disorienting. They would say something like this: Little Francis, assuming that's your name, one of the great things about living in a free and open society is that you have no choice but to understand and learn from those with whom you disagree. This is great for at least 4 reasons. First, the other guy may have the truth, and by engaging him, you have an opportunity to acquire it. Second, the other guy may not have the truth, but by confronting his challenges, you will have learned to better appreciate and understand your own beliefs and what justifies them. Third, you may have the truth, and thus when the other guy engages you, he has the opportunity to become more intellectually virtuous while making you a better friend because you have assisted him in acquiring the truth. Fourth, neither of you may have the full truth, but by dialoguing with each other, you may each have to adjust your beliefs, and as a consequence, not only draw closer to the truth, you draw closer to each other. Unquote. This rock-ribbed liberalism is being quickly replaced by a faint-hearted liberalism, whose advocates reject the core principles of rock-ribbed liberalism, the pursuit of truth and the presumption of liberty, and seek to replace them with the sovereignty of identity and the supreme blessedness of affirmation, euphemistically called dignity. Consider as an example what happened at Emory University in March of this year. Emory, like many schools such as Baylor and the University of Colorado, allows students to write messages in chalk on its sidewalks. Sometimes it is used to exercise political speech, as it was on the Emory campus, when someone chalked in large letters several phrases including Trump 2016, vote Trump, and accept the inevitable. They were all on campus. Apparently, 40 to 50 Emory students were so emotionally scarred by the sight of the chalked inscription that they publicly protested against the graffiti's very existence. Because Mr. Trump's harsh positions on immigration, especially on Muslim immigration, many of the students claimed that the chalked inscriptions were intended to be divisive and thus contrary to the welcoming inclusiveness to which Emory aspires. According to a Washington Post account, the protesting student shouted, "You are not listening. Come speak to us. We are in pain." The student newspaper, the Emory Wheel, reports one student saying that her, quote, first reaction to the chalking was one of fear. But she notes, "I told myself that it was a prank and that the responsible individual was probably laughing in their room. I told myself that Emory would do something about it," unquote. Although I certainly share the students' rejection of Mr. Trump's politics, their displays of emotional outrage and the language they have used to propagate them are deleterious to the primary purpose of a university, the pursuit of truth. Even more importantly, such displays ignore a simple Christian and human insight. Truth in this world is hardly ever safe. For the appeal to offense changes the question that should be assessed by members of that academic community. And what's the appropriate question? That is, the question should involve the grounds of the wrongness or rightness of Mr. Trump's views and the quality of his character. Instead, claiming offense exacerbates an aspect of our common nature that often impedes our ability to think clearly and carefully when untethered from our rational faculties. And here I'm going to use some ancient words, our concupiscible and irascible appetites. That is, those are the things that our reason is supposed to master, not acquiesce to. Unfortunately, Emory's president, James Wagner, did not seek to put these appetites in their proper place by showing his students how the passions, though not in themselves bad, must be subdued and harnessed by reason in order to have even a fighting chance of acquiring the truth. The pursuit of truth, however, doesn't even make a cameo appearance in his comments. This is what he states, quote, "During our conversation, the protesting students voiced their genuine concern and pain in the face of this perceived intimidation. After meeting with our students, I cannot dismiss their expression of feelings and concern as motivated only by political preference or oversensitivity. Instead, the students with whom I spoke heard a message, not about political process or candidate choice, but instead about values regarding diversity and respect that clash with Emory's own," unquote. To be sure, President Wagner affirms that, quote, "As an academic community, we must value and encourage the expression of ideas, vigorous debate, speech, dissent, and protest," unquote. But then he says in the next sentence, "At the same time, our commitment to respect, civility, and inclusion calls us to provide a safe environment that inspires and supports courageous inquiry," unquote. But here's the problem. A safe environment does not inspire courage, let alone an expression of ideas, vigorous debate, speech, dissent, and protest, unless these happen to be consistent with the prevailing campus orthodoxy. As we know from experience, institutionalizing the philosophy of safe spaces winds up rewarding ideological conformity while empowering the most vocal and active members of the community to marginalize and shame those they think are responsible for a perceived intimidation. What results, paradoxically, is an environment seemingly safe only for those who both conform to the campus's socio-political hegemony and want to be insulated from encountering ideas that may make them feel uncomfortable, but unsafe for those who believe that the primary purpose of a university is the pursuit of truth. For sometimes this pursuit leads certain members of the academic community to embrace and defend beliefs that clash with their own school's socio-political hegemony. I say seemingly safe because when you think about it, the advocates of safe spaces are really harming themselves. Consider this example. A few years ago, a young African-American man at Northwestern University refused to perform a piece of choral music assigned by his professor. His reason? The piece was based on the poetry of Walt Whitman, who was undoubtedly a racist. Here's what I published online in response to that student. Quote, "You do yourself no good by not seeing the greatness in even people who have held disreputable ideas. To look at Walt Whitman and just see a racist is precisely what makes racism wrong. You don't see the entire person in all his complexities, virtues, and foibles. You just see the race. By doing this, you artificially flatten the person, and thus you literally lie to yourself, for you intentionally deny the truth that a great man can have within him both grandeur and vice. If you want to be better than Whitman, rid yourself of the habits of mind that in him result in the beliefs that you now find offensive. The ability to separate the wheat from the chaff is a sign of intellectual maturity. Thus, discarding the wheat because you can't bear the chaff does not punish Mr. Whitman, it punishes you." Unquote. This is why the pursuit of truth rarely flourishes in safe spaces. It is often said that politics exists downstream from culture. If so, then the future of conservatism cannot lie exclusively in the quality of its ideas and arguments, though that is certainly important. Rather, it lies in the vitality of the institutions from which these ideas and arguments arise. So if conservatism is to flourish and contribute to America's political conversation, its adherents have to find ways to limit the scope of the administrative state, as well as to re-argue the case for the rock-ribbed liberalism that was once taken for granted as essential to American constitutional democracy. Thank you. So I'm sure you have some questions.
We have time for questions, absolutely.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for your talk. You make the case. You make the case that conservatives should embrace limited government and rock-ribbed liberalism, but you also make a very convincing case that that conservatives are excluded from the halls of power, from business corporations, and from various other areas. In such a situation, doesn't the exhortation to rock-ribbed liberalism and limited government seem irrelevant if you do not have the political and cultural power possible to make your case and implement your case and your plan?
That's a really good point. I think there's two ways to look at rock-ribbed liberalism. One, as a kind of legal project, right? You want the courts to sort of support this, but also as a cultural project. That is, and your point that you raised is really interesting given the nature of the way we communicate today and given the dominance of tech companies like Google and others, right? I mean, or Facebook, right? So you want to get your news, right? So what do? You Google something, or you go, you Google a particular name or an individual or an event, and right, what pops up? I mean, are you really sure that those are the, what sort of sources are you getting? So yeah, I mean, the difficulty today is that the space between private and public is vanishing very quickly. So it's not clear. I don't think that there is a government solution to this problem concerning. I would rather not have the government, let's say, have something like the fairness doctrine enforced on Google, because I think that's far worse, or whomever runs whatever search engine. But yeah, I do think the only way to change that is to make the case. And at the end of the day, I mean, that's the best we can do. I mean, but yeah, I mean, there's great irony here is that you have in corporate America, corporate America doing things to influence legislation, but technically they're not the government, right? So what happens in Indiana, you have that time Governor Pence signing a bill, state version of RFRA, and then the NCAA threatens to, whatever, I don't know, different sport. I think the NFL made it, all these companies and sports leagues threaten, but the government was actually technically never involved, right? There was a time where that kind of even corporate censorship was frowned upon, right? In other words, if anyone tried that publicly, it would, it would have a negative effect. But today, there seems to be only an upside to it. I mean, in terms of the corporate, I mean, at the end of the day, corporations want to make money. If they realize that they're going to make money going in that direction, they're going to do it, right? But I would hesitate to want the state to interfere in any way. So, but I do think, one third thing about that, I do think, though, public universities and colleges are a different thing altogether. I mean, there you have, those are state institutions, and I think they have an obligation to uphold a very high level of freedom of expression.
When you speak of growing and sustaining those subsidiary institutions from which conservative ideas come, are you thinking in economic, financial terms, or are you thinking strictly political, or are economic considerations? Are you thinking about growing, say, small business and those?
Absolutely, yeah. Not just social or civic or nonprofit institutions. I had that in mind when I was writing that, but I also, that was the primary focus of when I was writing it. But yeah, it also includes. Look, I think that conservatives obviously should, prosper and donate their money to institutions that in fact advance conservative ideas. I mean, at the end of the day, if you think about the great think tank movements of the 70s and 80s, think of Heritage Foundation, American Enterprise Institute, those only arise because very wealthy conservatives donated money. So yeah, I that's part of it as well, yes.
For some time now, we've had the Amish community among us that dress differently, that do not follow the technologies that our civilized way of living. They have their own way. Now we have a whole group of Muslims, communities are being formed that want to establish a Sharia law to operate their community. This is creating a lot of tension. How do we handle that in a conservative approach?
That's a great question. I know I'm not an expert on Islam or Sharia law. My concern, though, for legislation that tries to limit communities, here's my concern. I can easily imagine, let's say the state of Colorado or another state passed legislation that said that the government cannot take into consideration any sort of judicial practice in religious groups. The problem with that is that then I can easily see that kind of legislation being used by secularists to sort of interfere with cases of canon law within Catholicism, or even, let's say, certain evangelical groups that stick to, let's say, certain biblical law. So I'm a little nervous about that kind of legislation simply because I think I can see how it can be employed in ways in the future that may not be, I think, may be used against. So I mean, I also have a very strong religious liberty aspect to my overall political philosophy, and I'd rather err on the side of giving people liberty to form their own communities, even if there's a slight risk that bad things could happen, just because I don't trust the government to pull it off, right? So I'm kind of, I mean, this is, I know everyone's probably going to agree with me on this, but that's the kind of thinking that I have on that matter. So, it's interesting, you raised the question of the Amish. In a famous early 1970s case called Yoder versus Wisconsin, the Supreme Court let the Amish be excused from ordinary school compulsory laws because they have, in their tradition, after the 8th grade, children are sort of become apprentices, but not like the current guy that's running for office apprentice. I didn't mean to even make that joke. It just came. So it's interesting, the reasoning of the court in that case. The court winds up saying that we're going to carve out we're going to force Wisconsin to carve out this exemption because the Amish have this long and noble tradition of creating good citizens. It's unimaginable today that a court would actually make an assessment of the quality of that religious practice. But in my mind, the court actually did the right thing because what it didn't say, as a matter of principle, we're going to allow anybody to get out of 8th grade if they have any reason and we'll count it religious. What they said was, yeah, we'll count your religion or your reason as religious, but you have to show that it's contributing to the common good. I mean, it's a really interesting kind of argument. Again, something you won't hear today. In the Hobby Lobby case, Justice Alito, for example, continually refers to the beliefs of the Green family as deeply held, sincere religious beliefs, which are true enough, but the arguments that the Green family gave weren't merely theological arguments. They weren't just appeals to Scripture. They were philosophical and scientific arguments as to why they believed the embryo was a full-fledged member of the human community and why they didn't want to distribute drugs that killed those embryos to their employees. I mean, that seems to me even when a justice who I generally like kind of diminishes the quality of a religious belief, it bugs me. So, oh, there's the mic guy right there.
This is so our online participants.
Okay.
An observation followed by a question. So the observation is, if there's a future for conservatism, it's as a majority coalition, that it doesn't exist if it's a minority. And you made the case very well that during the Reagan era, there was a conservative coalition that was a majority, and then you made the case for why that coalition doesn't exist as a majority today. It seemed like there were elements of your talk where you were hinting at what a majority coalition would look like in the future. Could you clarify that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I was actually thinking when I was writing this of conservatives being in the minority. And I was thinking that we should shore up our own institutions first. That was, so when I think of, obviously I had in mind mostly religious conservatives. And I think in the United States today, the vast majority of conservatives are some sort of devout religious believer. They have institutions such as Colorado Christian University, denominations, churches, synagogues, and so forth. And I was thinking primarily about that. But in terms of building coalitions, I can easily envision, for example, a coalition with libertarians, especially on the whole government get out of the way thinking. So, for instance, this year, this is a very weird political year. This is the one year that I would have entertained supporting the libertarian ticket. Unfortunately, there's no libertarian running on the libertarian ticket. When given, in terms of the libertarians that I knew and grew up with, one of my friends at my first job, I taught at University of Nevada, Las Vegas, UNLV, and one of my friends was in the economics department named Murray Rothbard, and he was an anarcho-capitalist. He was like, I felt like a socialist next to him. He was he was really, really, a free market guy. And I remember Murray and I talking about this stuff, and he said, and he would talk, he had this kind of this high-pitched New York accent. I'm not going to try to imitate it here, but he said, I don't mind because I don't mind if you Christians like moved to some place like Barstow, California, and had your own little schools and stuff, as long as we could leave. There was a sense, and that kind of, and what I'm suggesting then is a kind of mini federalism then. Getting people, let's say, who don't agree with social conservatives on a lot of these moral issues, to just simply say, okay, we're going to let you have your own flourishing communities, and that to me, it's not clear whether that's even possible today, given the vast infrastructure of the administrative state. And that's where I think, like even after Obergefell, I thought, okay, what's the next hill to die on? And to me, it occurred that if at this point, let's say, you had people say, look, we understand that on an issue so deeply divisive as this, that people will come to different conclusions about the nature of marriage. After all, we live in a free society. Whenever you get a bunch of people together in a free society, they're going to come to different conclusions, which is, of course, is the heart of the kind of liberalism that arises in the 1970s, right? In fact, that liberalism of the 70s arises precisely to answer these questions. It's really the sexual revolution that animates people, like some of you may be familiar with the names of some of these philosophers, John Rawls, Ronald Dworkin, Judith Jarvis Thomson, Thomas Nagel. They're all writing during this time, and they're trying to figure out a way so that they can sort of do what they want, but at the same time make a case for people that are socially conservatives. And their argument was essentially, just leave us alone. And it's fascinating to see so that leave us alone crowd, I think, is ultimately the ally. But maybe culture can't be that way. I'll entertain this possibility. Maybe politics, like nature, abhors a vacuum. You really can't have a society with more than one culture, right? So.
One more question.
Thanks. You clearly don't see either of the statistically legitimate candidates in this election as acceptable options for the country. As a conservative and a Christian who wants to sort of take back the country to what it was meant to be, who do you support and endorse?
This isn't a courtroom, but I think I should plead the fifth, right? No, you know, when you say take back the country, I wouldn't even use that language. I think, nostalgia can be dangerous. So I don't think there ever was a golden age. I mean, I think back, my wife and I have this conversation, we think, oh, I really miss the 1980s. Actually I say, I miss that other Clinton, the 90s. So there's a sense in which we sometimes maybe read back into, whether it's our own past or the distant past, things that weren't as they really were. But no, I'm not going to answer the question. I'm just not going to answer the question. So, but it's a good question. It was a courageous question. No safe space. So thank you.
We're going to do one question because we did realize we took questions just from the left.
Oh, okay.
So we're going to do one on the right. And of course, if we're going to do one on the right, you got to do Randy Corcoran. So.
Thank you. I appreciated the kind of the satellite view of how we try and look ahead, because these movements they go, up and down, and they're very slow to grow. There's waning and advancing. But what I'm really focused on right now is the huge division that's right here on the ground level. The conservative movement right here in my own state and around the country is divided into 1,000 different pieces.
Yeah.
And what I was hoping to come away from, and I'm still trying to figure it out and hope you can help, is what message about the future of conservatism can we start to focus on that may bring some of these broken pieces back together?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think about that myself. And conservatives have always fought with each other. I was a delegate at the Republican Convention in 1992 in Houston. And I remember the fights we had. From Nevada, so we had fights about the platform. But once somebody was selected, there was obviously people rallied around that individual. I think today things have changed in several different regards. One is that I think people are impatient in the sense that they want everything at once, and so there's almost like a kind of purity within at least the Republican Party. I've given you, and there's also, I think, a lack of rhetorical artfulness that I think is so important. So 4 years ago, I was watching the debate, the primary debate, and I remember my governor, Rick Perry, was being critiqued rather strongly by Michelle Bachmann because he had signed legislation concerning that required, I think, underage girls to receive some kind of drug to prevent. It had to do with HPV. And he was just really ripping him. And I thought, I turned to my wife and I said, wouldn't it have been great if Michelle Bachmann had turned to Rick Perry and said, Governor, I know when you signed in that legislation, you really had your heart in the right place. You really meant to advance public health, and I'm not criticizing you for that. What I'm criticizing you is for a policy that I think ultimately does it. Can you imagine how different those sorts of debates would be? So instead of, I understand that people want to win, but at the end of the day, if you think about what happened this year, you had 17, right? And you knew at the end of November, maybe beginning of January, you knew that unless most of them left, there was one guy that was going to win. And yet none of them thought their party or their country worth falling on their sword for. And I just think that's astonishing to me. Now, of course, I've never been in that position. Here I'm a pointy-headed professor who, and I know it's different in politics. And of course, all of them are surrounded by consultants who say, no, you can't pull out, you'll win. This is what the data says. I understand that. But somebody looking from the outside in, it sure looked like what happened was going to happen. And it seems to me that we have to learn how to disagree agreeably and understand that, look, I'm pro-life, I'm pro-traditional marriage, I hold these views, but if somebody on the ticket that said that, let's say, maybe held views slightly differently, but then said, I'm going to make sure that your institutions are going to be protected. I'm not going to let the left go after you. I'd be willing to maybe consider that person, because I realize maybe this is the best I can get given what I have right now, and I know that I'd have an ear with that person. So, yeah, I mean, it's tough, and and the thing about, if you go back in American history, I mean, there's been vicious fights in the past, so it isn't like we're unique. But your question is certainly well placed, and I thank you for it.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you. Thank Dr. Beckwith.
Thank you. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you for just a second. I mean, friends, I studied philosophy. I have a degree in philosophy. That was like having a steak dinner. I'm going to have to digest that for a little while. Absolutely wonderful. I'd love a copy of that. See if we can put it in our Centennial Review, which is our monthly speech digest, which I think would be great for people to be able to take away in the future. We're going to leave you with this fabulous 1776 tie here. These have been worn during presidential primary debates. Ben Carson wore his red 1776 Centennial Institute tie debate. And probably my favorite moment ever was when Ken Buck wore his blue 1776 tie when he was grilling the commissioner from the IRS. I sat there watching it live on TV, just being like, yeah, we made it.
Well,
so this was wonderful.
Thank you
very
very
much, Dr. Beckwith.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yep, thanks. So, as you may have been, if you follow us on social media, you know we've been fighting very hard against Proposition 106, this legalized doctor-assisted suicide. There was a great moment last week when the Denver Post reversed its position in the editorial board and came out against Proposition 106. That was a tremendous victory. This has been a campaign that's been a great partnership between Colorado Christian University and the Archdiocese of Denver. We've linked arms together along with Focus on the Family and Colorado Family Action. Colorado is a very libertarian state on social issues, and so this is an uphill battle for us. We have yard signs in the back. If you'd like to get a no on Prop 106 yard sign, please get that. Ballots went out yesterday, so they're going to start to be received by your friends and neighbors. Please tell them that you stand for the sanctity of life and against doctor-assisted suicide. Thank you all for coming. Don't forget, November 14th, we'll be right back here with John Andrews. Have a good night.